We are losing this case.
Between the judge reframing it as income inequality
and the jury unable to wrap their heads around hard data, we're in the weeds.
Emphasizing inequality is a mistake. What we ought to be worried about is poverty. In a wealthy society, we should be able to ensure those who are least well off have some sort of basic human dignity.
The information that we have about the American workforce is that about 1.3 million, maybe give or take, are paid the minimum wage. And then there are some workers that are paid less than the minimum wage. So we're really talking about a little over 3 million people in the American economy who are paid at or below the minimum wage.
Senator, you came up with a dollar amount for the new law?
I did.
So you put a value on the price of labor based on a hunch?
We consulted many experts.
I think we need to be very careful about how we do the studies and interpret them. So for example, if we look at the effects of minimum wage that's levied in a town like Manhattan, it's going to have very different impacts than maybe a rural part of Alabama. In fact, the people that are receiving the minimum wage tend to be teenagers, and of those teenagers, many of them come from households where the mean income is $70,000 a year. So what we're really seeing is the Tommies of the world. Those are the people we want to help. We want to help them be able to help their families. In large part, the minimum wage is not being directed at them. In fact, they are the most vulnerable recipients of the unintended consequences of the minimum wage.
I try to help out this neighborhood kid, but it's hard enough to keep a store like mine out of the red. If I could have paid him the minimum wage, I would have.
What you're doing when you raise the minimum wage, you are giving 30% or more of the American workforce a raise of some amount. So it's a significant increase in the purchasing power of the working population of the country.
The problem with the minimum wage in terms of being a policy to help the poor is that it doesn't really provide much of an increase in wages because they often end up losing hours or they can't find another job if they have to leave.
Think of Philip, the store owner. He can only employ you 20 hours a week.
Yes, of course, the price of labor went up, but the demand for it also went up because the purchasing power of the population improved as a whole. That's the practical argument.
Small business owners, like the one we see in our story, if they have to pay this minimum wage, if people are going to come and arrest you and take you to jail if you don't, then you're going to have to find a way to compensate for that. The way you're going to do it is by raising prices to consumers.
And it raises prices more for exactly those products the poor are more likely to buy.
An open, well-functioning market is a necessary condition to lift people out of poverty, and that includes labor market prices. But as soon as you start to change the prices, you change the incentives.
It is clearly in the interest of the store owner to not stock the shelves himself all day, not because he's arrogant or a jerk or doesn't feel like doing it, but because his time is better used doing something else. Tommy walks into the store and just needs some cash. He wants to work hard. He wants a chance. And so the rights of these two people, it's very clear, I believe, that they should have the right to engage in a voluntary arrangement where they determine a wage.
I mean, we came to an agreement. What I could afford and what he would take.
So two consenting parties entered into this business relationship?
But actually, this minimum wage law obfuscates that right. And it says, no, you actually can't agree to $6 an hour. You know, it must be higher. And so the legislation is impeding on the rights of these two individuals, and it results in a subpar outcome.
I do need some help around here, but I can't. Sorry.
Can't, or you don't want to hire me?
Oh, it's this new wage law.
That story is about the liberty of the store owner. What the employer wants is to make a profit. What the worker needs is to make a living. That's a very uneven power relationship. That is why we have unions, that is why we have standards, and that is why we have minimum wages.
It didn't have to come to this.
You better believe it did. You took advantage of him.
There is a power imbalance. Absolutely there's a power imbalance because this young man is in an economically marginal position. He needs to have some way to work his way out of that. Minimum wage makes it harder, not easier, for him to do that. You can't use your concern for someone to impose a policy that makes them even worse off. It relegates him to a permanently marginal position. So absolutely there are power imbalances, but markets provide a way out of that. I actually think that many of the objections to markets are misplaced objections to the pre-existing distribution of wealth and power, which probably is unjust.
So it's your opinion that the government had to intervene?
Without regulation, workers could be paid below a living wage.
Smith set a standard, which is a standard for food, clothing, and shelter. What it takes, in other words, for the journeyman or the laborer to live a decent life. That is what the standard that we now call a living wage.
People who advocate a living wage want what is best for the poor. And that's why economics is a really powerful tool here, because it helps us assess whether it's an appropriate means to get to that end.
Can you tell me what the Gini index is?
It's a statistical measure of income distribution for a country's residents.
So a number that represents income inequality.
Basically, the way the Gini index works is it's ranked from 0 to 1. A score of 0 would indicate perfect income equality. It would literally mean that everyone has equal income. A Gini score of 1 would indicate perfect income inequality. And this would quite literally mean that one person has all the income and everybody else has 0.
Wealthier countries tend to be more egalitarian because to be wealthy, you have to have income spread out over a large number of people. That's what's called having a middle class.
Well, the problem is that if you compare two societies and both of them are 0.5, all that means is the degree of inequality is the same in the two. It doesn't tell you anything about the level of income.
Venezuela and Singapore have almost identical Gini indexes. So income inequality isn't an indicator of quality of life, of economic progress for the poor.
Venezuela has 1/4 of the income of Singapore. So even though they have the same level of inequality, poor people in Singapore are 4 times better off than the poor people in Venezuela. So the point that Holly is making, you couldn't say that two countries that have the same inequality are in any important way the same, and two countries that have different Gini coefficients might not be that different.
I'm trying to show that income inequality doesn't mean that a country can't be prosperous.
Is income equality the goal? Would we want to live in a society where we all had the same amount of income? I would say that if you understand human nature, you would say that this is actually not possible because we all have different subjective values and preferences, attitudes towards risk, and I would claim that what we really want to know is how are people doing, particularly those at the bottom, and what does it take to get out of the bottom?